Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. The issue of childhood psychology, the legacy of childhood, is a subject that many of our authors have written books about. We've had many discussions over the years. Over the last couple of weeks, we've had a couple of interesting authors on the show. One, Janet Hibbs, who has written a book about how kids are growing up a lot older these days. You're not done yet parenting young adults in an age of uncertainty. Dr. Hibbs suggests that many 20-somethings are going home and they haven't quite outgrown their childhood, and it's changing the nature of families and even the idea of what age and childhood is. And then last week we did a show with Mark Hauser, neuroscientist, someone who had taught at Harvard University, has a new book out, Vulnerable Minds, The Harm of Childhood Trauma and the Hope of Resilience. And in a way, like Hibbs, Hauser is talking about childhood and second chances and getting beyond childhood, and yet at the same time recognizing how important it is. Obviously, it's a given in our development. My guest today is pursuing in some ways similar themes. Dr. Judy Ho is a neurophysician, neuroscientist, popular writer, media personality. She has a new book out, The New Rules of Attachment, and she is joining us today. Judy, where are you joining us from? I forgot to ask in our preview.
Oh, yeah. Hey, Andrew. Thanks so much for having me on your show. I'm from Los Angeles, and that's where I am currently.
Lovely. Well, I'm in San Francisco, so we're not too far
Oh,
apart.
yeah. Well, I used to live in the Bay Area for years because that's where I went to school in college. So I love it up there.
So, Dr. Judy, let's talk about this issue of attachment and childhood. Sometimes I have guests on who seem to want their patients, their readers, to leave childhood, others who want them to return. What are you arguing in The New Rules of Attachment? Is childhood something we need to escape from or something we need to embrace?
Great question. I don't think it's something that we have to escape from, although I understand that feeling when you've had past experiences that were challenging, possibly even traumatic. You wish that you could just bury that and just move on. But unfortunately, the lessons that we learned in our childhood, they kind of live on through our inner child, this metaphorical little us that's still present today, that has some pains and unmet needs, but as a result has developed certain rules for life that you're still using as an adult, even though your situation has changed and it's not serving you. And a lot of times people don't realize that they have these rules for life. They just see the actions that they wish they didn't take, or they notice these negative feelings that they wish they didn't have, but they don't realize that until they unpack that piece of their childhood, make peace with it, and move forward, creating new rules that are going to be more effective for their life, they're going to essentially find themselves in some of these same patterns over and over again.
Do you agree, Judy, with Janet Hibbs that we're growing up a lot later and that many people, and I use that word carefully, in their 20s who we traditionally or historically assumed are adult remain children? Is there something changing in the way in which aging is taking place?
Yeah, I think that there are so many different interesting cultural ideas about, at the same time, hating certain parts of your childhood, not wanting to revisit it. But then the other part of it is pining for that time when we were younger and wanting to embrace this sort of ageless idea that you're
The
not going to get
innocence, is it
older.
this endless search for innocence, which of course is impossible to actually
Exactly.
rediscover, because by definition innocence is something that you don't know about.
Exactly. And I think that there is a part of us that wants to return to that idea of, wow, this is a blank slate moment. This is a time in our childhood, maybe that sense of innocence, that awe about the world. But also this idea that maybe as you get older, you're kind of stuck with the life you have, which of course is something that I don't believe, because if I believe that, I would not be a psychologist. I definitely think that change is possible at any age. And even to heal our childhood wounds, that can happen at any age of your life and at any stage that you're in.
Well, speaking of healing childhood wounds, what do you make of Mark Hauser's thesis that there are a billion, perhaps 2 billion damaged minds in the world today, people who have experienced great harm as children? Do you think there's some truth to that, that the vast majority of humans in the world today have experienced what he calls childhood trauma?
I think that there's different forms and levels of trauma. Recently, in the psychology world, a lot of practitioners and their patients have been speaking about this idea of micro traumas. And I don't really know if that's necessarily a good way to distinguish between the different kinds of stress that you might have experienced. In some ways, I think when you say something like micro trauma, it makes it seem like it's not as important. It's not
It's
really
not
true.
traumatic. I mean, the
Like, what's
term
the point?
microtrauma is a contradiction in terms of it's micro, it's not traumatic.
Exactly. And I think that we're trying to make too fine of a point on this stuff. I think that for the most part, I do agree that the majority of us have had some period in our childhood lives where we don't wish to repeat. We don't wish to revisit. It was traumatic in some way. Sometimes people don't describe their childhoods as traumatic, but then as they think back on certain memories, they realize that a lot of it was negative. So they can say, well, I don't know if I had this huge traumatic event happen, but I also didn't have a happy childhood. So what does that mean? I think what it means is that for most of us, even if the majority of parents are trying to do their best, oftentimes they're wrestling with their own stuff. They're wrestling with their own mental health concerns, physical concerns, financial concerns, whatever you might have. And it's affecting, of course, the kind of messages that they may have given their children at a time when we're just learning everything, soaking up everything around us, wanting to learn about the world. And that's where these rules are derived from, these ideas of worldview, how we approach life going forward. So I think that that has a lot to do with it.
Do you think the idea of a happy childhood, which people seem to feel they have a right to, is rather like apple pie or the American dream? It's a delusion, it's a convenient narrative in which we build or imagine fictional lives.
Yeah, I think that this idea of having this happy childhood, it seems like something that people are wish was part of their narrative or maybe lament that it's not part of their narrative. But I really don't know anybody who could say that their childhood, even if they describe it as happy, didn't go through some level of adversity as a child. So I do think that this idea of chasing after a happy childhood, I mean, what does that really accomplish? I think the most important thing, because it applies to the rest of your life, is that when you do come upon challenging times, adverse times, that you know how to cope, that you have confidence in your ability to get through it. And some people may feel more fragile in life. They may feel like, well, if anything negative happened, they would go to pieces. And maybe they go back to their childhood, they blame it on an quote unquote unhappy childhood. But really, what we're all after, because we're all going to experience difficulties and pain throughout life as we grow up, is can we manage that? Can we manage the stress, evolve to the other side, and still be able to not only survive, but actually thrive and increase our confidence in handling difficult and challenging situations?
Judy, the subtitle of your book, which I think reflects our therapeutic culture, is How to Heal Your Relationships, Reparent Your Inner Child, and Secure Your Life Vision. Before we get to that reparenting of your inner child, am I right? Do we live in a therapeutic culture in which this kind of language, which maybe 25 or 50 years ago would have been foreign and odd, is now mostly taken for granted?
Yeah, I do think that it's taken for granted. And I think that a lot of times when we think about these ideas, they sound good maybe, and they maybe even appear in pop psychology, but people haven't really taken the time to break them down or to really understand how it might specifically apply to their life. And then most of all, I think people sometimes are at a loss of what to do about it. How do we move forward? How can we make practical strategies happen in our lives that are actually going to improve it? And so I think even though as a society, we've definitely done a lot of great work in dispelling certain mental health and mental illness myths and removing some of the stigma about receiving care and what it really means to actually work on yourself. I do think that there's still a lot of misunderstandings, and maybe it just feels a little bit insurmountable to some people.
Well, you're a professional in this therapeutic world. You call yourself a licensed clinical and forensic neuropsychologist. You mentioned earlier that you grew up in the Bay Area. Did you wake up one morning and decide you wanted to become a licensed clinical and forensic neuropsychologist? Or how did you know that you were interested in the culture of the mind, of therapy, of neuropsychology?
Yeah, well, I did spend some of my youth in the Bay Area, but I also spent some of my youth in Taiwan and New York and East Los Angeles. And I became interested in psychology when I was in high school and part of the Big Sister, Big Brother program. So that was something that at the time I thought, well, that sounds kind of fun. Plus, it's a good resume builder for when I apply to college in a couple of years. But little did I know that that experience would be so foundational to my career development. So I remember that I was assigned a 10-year-old girl. I was only 15 at the time. She was my mentee, but what did I know about anything? I knew nothing. I didn't take a psychology class that wasn't even available at my high school. So all I did was just show up every week at our assigned time and take her to ice cream, go to the park, go to the movie, just sit with her. And it became pretty apparent over time that I was the most consistent person in her life because she had been out of several different foster homes at that point already, and she was only 10 years old. And I realized the power that one person can have over another's not only mental well-being, but just their sense of self. I think that I contributed to her feeling cared about and that people in her life weren't just going to up and leave her. And I really didn't do anything except essentially be her friend like an older sister. And that was when I became most interested in psychology. The fact that we can have this impact on another person, and sometimes even really unwittingly, or not really knowing exactly what you did, because all I did was show up and take her to ice cream and go to the park. But I realized that it became really important to her to see me during that time every single week. She was looking forward to it. I was her confidant. It was somebody that she could rely on, and that was something that she'd been missing in her life.
Not only did you then write this new book, the new rules of attachment, but you're a practicer of it as well. I wonder, you mentioned that you spent some of your childhood in Taiwan. It always seems to me, as someone who came to America, that there's something about America, I'm not entirely sure what, that
Mhm.
lends itself to neuropsychology and this therapy culture. In your experience, as someone who knows both East Asian and American cultures and familiar, you've lived in both parts of the world, is there something cultural about this, or do you think most cultures in the world now understand to borrow the title of your book, the new rules of attachment, or at least the new rules of therapy?
Yeah, I think that as we move forward, there's been a collective of therapists, psychologists who really practice their work in an eclectic fashion. They're really bringing in both Western and Eastern ideas. They're bringing in ideas that are much more well established in the literature, at least over the last few decades, like cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavioral therapy, but then also infusing it with these other concepts like mindfulness, which of course is also evidence based. But people don't necessarily think about that when they think about scientifically informed care. They're not necessarily saying, well, mindfulness has got to be it, or just this idea of living according to your highest values. I mean, these are some ideas that I think haven't been revisited for some time, but have been with us for centuries and thousands of years. And people are realizing that it's really helpful to integrate all of these ideas because for every single individual, they're going to have a different toolkit that works for them, that helps them to heal whatever it is that they're suffering from. And so I think that more and more we're seeing that kind of combination offering through the psychologists and psychotherapists in our time.
You came up with this term, which I have to admit I've never heard, dialectical behavior therapy, and you feature this on your website. It brings to mind Karl Marx, who had a dialectical theory of history. I don't suppose Marx wrote about dialectical behavioral therapy. But I'm wondering, is there a father or a mother theorist for whom your work is indebted? Freud, Jung, others?
Yeah, great question. Well, I would say that I'm inspired by multiple different individuals. I would say that Aaron Beck is definitely somebody that was foundational, especially in the early years of my professional development. His work on cognitive behavioral therapy, that was really huge. Marsha Linehan with dialectical behavior therapy, Russ Harris with acceptance and commitment therapy. But more recently, I've been really digging into the work of Jung and digging into the work of Carl Rogers. So, really speaking to, some of these other aspects that really bring together a treatment program where you're really recognizing the whole individual and taking into account their past, but not necessarily dwelling on it, using their past as a way to find methods of moving forward and healing. And then, of course, because of attachment theory, have been really revisiting Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth work over the last 10, 15 years for myself.
Well, we'll get to attachment theory after the break. I want to remind everyone that we're talking with Dr. Judy Ho, new book out, The New Rules of Attachment, How to Heal Your Relationships, Reparent Your Inner Child, and Secure Your Vision. We'll talk more specifically about the book after the break. But I want to remind you that this show is brought to you with the help of our friends at Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics. Does a great job, as I hope we do at Keen On, making sense of our culture. We're going to do a short video on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Dr. Judy to talk more about the new rules of attachment. So don't go away, anyone. You'll learn a lot after the break. See you in a second.
News, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas, it's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Dr. Judy Ho, author of an interesting new book, The New Rules of Attachment, How to Heal Your Relationships, Reparent Your Inner Child, and Secure Your Life Vision. Judy, let's talk specifically about the book and this idea of healing relationships. Do you think the core of much of our therapeutic culture is our sense that we don't manage our relationships well, that we're lonely, that we're isolated? This seems to reflect a lot of the research being done recently.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, of course, with the onset of the pandemic, I think there's been a lot more attention on this concept of loneliness because people, for the first time, were actually talking about it. Whereas maybe people have already been suffering from it, but there just wasn't as much attention to it, or maybe not as much conscious conversation. But certainly, as you alluded to, there's been a lot of research in the last few years, especially about this epidemic of loneliness that people feel and dispelling myths about loneliness, that you can be with a lot of people and still feel lonely. You can be in a quote unquote happy relationship and still struggle with loneliness. And that loneliness, if it's unchecked, can lead to so many difficulties, not only in your mental health, but also your physical health. So that there was a series of research studies that suggested that loneliness could lead to the development of chronic illnesses, risk for early mortality, and among other things that obviously would just take away from you living a quality and joyful life. And I think that the core of it is really about the fact that human beings, we are programmed evolutionarily and biologically to crave connection. We need it. We are social beings, and we would not be able to survive and certainly not thrive without a feeling of meaningful connection to at least a few other people in this world. You don't have to have a million friends. That's not the goal. But you have to have those quality connections. And the reason why that's so important too is that when we feel like we have quality connections, we're able to not be in fight or flight all the time. We're able to get into those states of rest and relaxation. We're able to think about things above survival and be able to self-actualize. And I think that that's something that people, miss about why loneliness is so important as a problem to solve. It's because when human beings are isolated and alone, you're constantly in this survival mode. You're constantly in this fight or flight feeling. And that's just not a place that we are designed to be at. We're designed to have those little moments where we get into fight or flight, but then we're supposed to reset. And I think now, with just everything going on with loneliness and daily chronic stress, more and more people are saying, I feel amped up all the time. I just can't get to that point of really being able to relax.
This feeling of being amped up all the time, of being anxious, of not being able to relax, some writers, observers, critics, especially of technology, have suggested that a lot of it is bound up with social media and that that's affecting particularly younger people. Do you buy this argument that a lot of our anxiety and loneliness is rooted in some people's addiction, it would seem, to social media and the internet in general, which creates a kind of fake connectivity? And you have all these quote unquote friends on Facebook or TikTok or Instagram, but they're not real friends.
Exactly. And I do think that the younger generation, there's two things happening. One is most of their connection is quote unquote connection. The quality of it, that is what is in question. But most of their social connection does take place online nowadays. And older generations, obviously, we all still use social media probably to some degree, but it's not as much in the mix as it is for the younger population. The other pieces are younger people have gotten used to talking about mental health more. This is sort of a more normal conversation among that age group versus, older individuals, certainly people who are, baby boomers. That's just not a common conversation they might even have. So there's more of an awareness of what's going on and how that's affecting their mental health. And then there's the fact that they're relying more on online sources for social support. And it's just not really that great of a support system for most people. Like anything else, maybe it's really about moderation. But I think the problem with social media that isn't inherent in some of these other ways that we connect in real life is that there's a million things going on. You could be doing 5 different things online, have 5 apps open while also looking at your laptop. When you're in person, it's a lot harder to manage that. And so you're really much more focused on the experience that you're having when you're in real life. And then the other piece is, of course, the inherent competition or this feeling that there's always something better around the corner. So then there's a lot of social comparisons that are happening in social media. Recently, there's been this emerging trend because the app has allowed on Snapchat a way for you to have essentially a solar system around you when you're a user of Snapchat. So the solar system is you as the sun, which of course is inherently interesting because that's very self-serving.
And that's SUN rather than
Yeah.
SON. Right?
SUN. Yeah. So you're already the sun. You're already the center of your own universe. That's just a default of what Snapchat places you at as a user. But then it automatically ranks how close you are to people by putting them as the different planets of the solar system. So if you're the sun, who is your Mercury? Who is your Venus? Who is your Jupiter and Uranus? And so then it's causing all of these fights and arguments among young people because people are saying, well, my boyfriend just realized that on my Snapchat, he's Jupiter. And this other guy who supposedly is a platonic friend, Snapchat rated him as my Mercury. And so now it's causing this huge fight in their relationship. But that stress, even though it sounds slightly comical, is real for young people because social experience is so important for the teenage development of identity and who they are and how people are going to respond to them. And so I think that especially when they're using social media at this very delicate time, it can be very, very harmful to their mental health.
Yeah, it seems, Judy, as if 2 things are going on simultaneously, which are the root of the problem. On the one hand, we have a culture where everything is focused on the self.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, or perhaps simultaneously or in parallel or interconnected, is this endless weakening of the sense of the self, of who we are, of how we relate, of our sense of ourselves and our confidence. Is that true? Are these 2 things, are they opposite sides of the same coin?
I think that that's possible. I think that a lot of times when we're looking at how people are experiencing their social world now, there's a lot of dialectic to that. So as you're asking this question, I'm thinking about some of the premises of dialectical behavior therapy, which is inherently
And
about
explain what that is, because I sort of joked earlier, half jokingly, that Marx could have come up with this. I'd never heard this term before. What does it mean?
Yeah, so dialectical behavior therapy or dialectics is really just about, juggling these like two sides of the spectrum. And that for most of us, it's always about balancing those two sides, these two drives or two needs that we have that might feel like they're in conflict, but it's also just part of the human experience. So for a lot of people, there's that wanting of healing, but then there's also that wanting of maybe just staying where you are because at least you know how to cope. And so dialectical behavior therapy is all about that spectrum of it's just two sides of the same coin. How do we kind of come together with our wise mind to manage the things that we're thinking about? And oftentimes that it's normal to have two ideas about things, that it's okay to be in conflict because that's part of the human existence and the human experience. And I do think that that comes into play here. And that's why dialectical behavior therapy can be so helpful for people who might be struggling with connection, with their social life, with whether or not they really want closeness versus being.
Is it a form? Sorry to interrupt. Is it a form of therapy? I mean, it sounds like
Yeah,
a
yeah. Dialectical behavior therapy is a form of therapy. And so there's 4 different categories of skills that we work on in DBT. One is emotion regulation. The second is mindfulness. The third one is distress tolerance. And the fourth one is social effectiveness. And so I think that it's this idea of achieving balance in all of those different areas and also working with the sides of yourself that are in conflict and realizing that that's really normal. But how do we deal with it now that we know that there is that conflict? How do we resolve it to the point where you can actually move forward from the things that are troubling you and not get stuck in some kind of life where you feel like you're constantly just dealing with that idea of that dialectic of being on two sides of the same coin.
Judy, thinking about tech, even before the invention of the internet, there were sociologists, they tended to be men, although some were women, Daniel Bell, Christopher Lasch, who warned us not so much of an epidemic of loneliness, but an epidemic of narcissism. I'm not sure if you're familiar with these writers, but could one argue that this whole narrative, all the problems that you address and you deal with on a daily basis, it's all built into the sort of post-Second World War capitalist market American society?
Very interesting. I mean, I definitely think that we're at a time in our human existence where most of us are now getting the luxury of all of this self-reflection, right? And that happens because we've gotten to a point where you're not in fight or flight all the time. There isn't this, huge societal struggle, at least for most of us in most parts of the world. Not all, right? But certainly in Western cultures, more than not, that you have this luxury to be self-reflecting all the time, to think about what your needs are and to think about individuating and not necessarily about what's for the greater good sometimes. I do think that there's a place where that can get to be a little too much and you're starting to miss out on why all the self-reflection. Is this actually for the benefit of you and the people around you, or is it just becoming kind of this self-indulgent thing? And I think this idea of narcissism is also interesting. I think that certainly in Western culture it's almost admirable to be a narcissist. At least that's sometimes the messages we're getting. Like, oh yeah, think about yourself. What are your needs, etc. But if you go to other parts of the world, and certainly if you visit collectivistic cultures, and that's actually my culture of origin. I am from Taiwan. It's a collectivistic society, so it's like your own ideas don't necessarily matter, and people don't necessarily want to hear about them. But certainly, this idea of always talking about yourself, always thinking about yourself. And to that point, a lot of people who show narcissistic qualities are actually defensive narcissists. So what we mean by that is they're actually very, very insecure on the inside. And they feel like they have to project out this idea of I'm the most important, my needs matter the most, because they're trying to essentially pull the wool over other people's eyes and essentially try to act as if they're important so that other people would think that they're important. And that's something that we deal with a lot when I work with some of my patients and getting them to recognize that pattern and where does it come from.
Yeah, I don't want to turn this into a Donald Trump conversation, but I don't think it's any coincidence that his niece, who's in your business as a therapist, and you're a psychologist, probably still has the best critique of him as a needy narcissist. Let's end, Judy, on a couple of things from the book. Firstly, I joked or half joked earlier about reparenting your inner child, but those are your terms. How do we do it? If you've used this language, some people might smile a little bit at it, but we probably all want to get back to that inner child if we can. Is it possible?
Yeah, it is possible. And, I probably was one of those people who probably chuckled when somebody talked to me about inner child work or reparenting. 10 years ago, I would just laugh and be like, okay, that sounds like woo woo stuff. And I don't know how scientific it is. But, now being on the other side of seeing so many patients transform through inner child work and reparenting, I really am a believer. And I think that it's just something that goes to the wayside because we think that as adults, we should just, essentially man up and not talk about these things that bothered us as children or not act like children. Obviously, society does not treat you well if you start acting like a child, and you'll get chastised for it. But that's not what we're talking about. The inner child is that part of you that's super innocent, that still has needs that maybe it just didn't get met when they were children. And as they grew to be an adult, they found ways to tuck that side of themselves away. But that actually leads to a lot of self-critique and self-derogation and a lack of self-compassion. And if we can't be compassionate to ourselves, then how do we expect other people to be compassionate with us? How do we expect to achieve positive outcomes because there's a part of us that might think we don't deserve it? I mean, it leads to so much negative self-talk. So reparenting helps you to reduce the amount of negative self-talk and to help you to actually self-actualize and to be able to create these new rules for life where things are more at a balance as opposed to always thinking about the terrible things that might come and how you might have to defend yourself against them. So how do we do reparenting work? Well, it starts very simply with just recognizing that there have been parts of your life that obviously haven't been ideal and that there were needs that you didn't get to meet when you were younger and that you're still looking for now. And so first, just finding out what those needs are. And there's a lot of different ways to do it. I think the easiest route to it is really just through a visualization, calling up a time in your childhood when maybe you had been disappointed, upset with something, and then asking yourself, well, what was it that I needed in that moment that maybe didn't get communicated or was communicated and then shut down? What was that need? And then finding some small way to meet that need for that part of yourself. And it doesn't mean that you're going to change everything overnight, but it's this idea of constantly checking in to say, what is it that I really truly need or want in this moment? And is there a way that I can give that to myself instead of waiting for somebody to do it for me, waiting for my situation to turn around? Essentially using your adult self, who is so much more capable and has more resources, to start healing that part of yourself that maybe thought that they couldn't count on anyone else, or that believe that negative outcomes were definitely going to happen to them. It's really starting to change your idea about who you are and what you might be able to achieve in this world if you're able to put your effort to it.
Well, final question. These kind of books often come with promises. And the promises, at least in your new book, The New Rules of Attachment, is the ability to secure your life vision. I'm not going to question you on that because, of course, you can't prove it one way or the other. But I'm curious, do we all, Judy, have life visions? And is it something that for you as a therapist, a neurophysician, is it something you want to encourage in your patients, this idea of a life vision, of a kind of calling?
Yeah, I think it's less about a specific calling in life and more about what do you visualize your life to be. We like to ask our clients this miracle question, which is, if you woke up tomorrow and all your major problems have gone away, what would that life actually look like? Take us through it beat by beat. From the minute that you wake up, what would that consist of? What would you be thinking or feeling? And really getting them to remove any barriers of second guessing themselves or thinking they don't deserve a better life, and asking them, well, if you did actually have this miracle happen overnight, what would it look like? And how do we get you there? The life vision isn't a perfect vision. It isn't that your life is like amazing and that you never have problems again, but it is the life that you, if you dare to let yourself think about it, the life that you dreamed that you could have if you put your efforts to it, if you had the right people in your life, whatever you think the excuse was, let's remove those excuses and let's talk a little bit about what that vision would look like. And when people have insecure attachment, they're often afraid to dream of that, or their dream isn't complete. Like they'll start thinking about something that they want and then start making excuses for why it's not going to happen. So I do think it's an important therapeutic tool, because without being able to understand what that looks like, how can you even get there? So it really offers clarity for what people want to achieve in the different areas of their life.